I think that there has to be a lot of improvements that has to be made because, in a very recent judgment about the race discrimination ordinance, actually, the police is not seen as a form of service. And, what that implies is that the police can actually do racially discriminatory acts and get away with it, kind of. And so, this part of the ordinance is still not amended. So you can kind of see there's still some room for improvement, about the awareness of racial discrimination and just how you behave yourself in front of ethnic minorities.
But then what's stopping Hong Kong from having another Black Lives Matter movement? Because you just mentioned, right, police doesn't have any accountability for any discriminatory acts, and the whole BLM was based on the fact that there was a discriminatory action, the killing of George Floyd, right? So what's stopping Hong Kong from having just another movement on the same lines? I think it's not that far. I mean, it's just because I've heard stories. One of my friend, he told me that he was going back home at night. I think it was 1 a.m. He was alone and near Chun King Mansion, so one of the most infamous places in Hong Kong for all the bad stuff that happens there. But yeah, so he was around that area and he was randomly searched. He was put on the ground and with his hand behind his back, and then he was searched completely, and that was humiliating and horrifying for a person who was just 18 years old or 19 years old, right? And the fact that he was actually a non-local student. He's not from Hong Kong. So what do you do in that case? I mean, you were searched randomly for no reason. You're just a student. You're walking around minding your own business. And so what's stopping that?
I think there are several reasons for that. So each society has its unique set of social circumstances, historic conditions that forge a different scenario. So in Hong Kong, I mean, race issues are sensitive issues in many societies in the world, especially those with diverse populations. And in the US, we know that race issues have always been a very sensitive issue, and it's always a focal point of every presidential debate, right? But the reason for that is partially that the US has always been a multiracial society, even though in the past there were a lot of more explicit discriminations, but it has always been a multiracial society. It was founded by immigrants. It was built by immigrants. So they've always, like, people subconsciously acknowledge that this society consists of different ethnicities. And then their struggles and then their, interactions and confrontations are on the table. We can talk about it. But of course, I mean, there's always, a spectrum. People can become oversensitive about race, which tends to be the case in the US in some cities. But I would say that Hong Kong is the exact opposite. We are being undersensitive about the race issue. People don't really recognize that Hong Kong is a multiracial society. In fact, my master's research is a case study of that secondary school I worked at. And some teachers told me that, if you ask a regular Hong Kong local Chinese what consists of the local identity, like what is a Hong Kong person, they would say Chinese, like the race is tied to this identity. And that's another thing unique about Hong Kong. There hasn't been a very clearly defined and expressed identity formation. When you talk about what makes a US citizen, people can talk about constitutional values. This is what makes us American. In the US, they have so-called Britishness, which is also a set of values, right? A set of historic acknowledgements and understandings. But in Hong Kong, you ask someone what makes a Hong Kong citizen, then there's not really, a very profound set of discussions on this topic. People still understand what makes up a Hong Kong citizen as on a very superficial level. It has to be racially Chinese, Cantonese speaking, born and raised here, right? And actually one scholar that I read a paper from, he said that the Hong Kong identity is derived from an othering process. I'm a Hong Konger because you are not. Right? I'm not a Hong Konger because this or that. I'm a Hong Konger because you are not, because I'm different from you. So this really causes a lot of problems as well. So we have to acknowledge this uniqueness in the Hong Kong society.
And so I remember you mentioned in your TED Talk that you mentioned about a part about a city being intercultural versus multicultural. And that was very interesting to me because you said that as soon as you bring in the conversation about any XYZ minority mattering, that this, let's say, ethnic Indians matter or ethnic Pakistanis matter, and that sort of takes away the whole that sort of takes away the whole problem from the fact that then you're sort of saying that, okay, then you're segregating at that point. You're saying that these people are different. But then if you don't do that, you're not acknowledging any problem. That's the argument from the other side, right? But if you do that, then you're segregating them and then you're putting them in this separate spot. You're like, okay, you are not a part of what the local society is, and you guys are different. So those people are gonna feel different. And how do we reach this balance?
So this is not only in Hong Kong. Multiculturalism and multicultural education as a concept was actually first developed in the US. And it was first a reaction to the civil rights movement. It was firstly about Black students, basically, African Americans. And then multiculturalism actually developed to include not only racial minorities, ethnic minorities, but also disability students with disability, gender, social class, many different factors that can render you disadvantaged in education. So the reason why there is this new term now, interculturalism or intercultural education, is precisely the observation of what you just mentioned. Scholars have realized that when we emphasize multiculturalism, when we emphasize the multiple entities, we're drawing boundaries. We are emphasizing differences. We are already creating groups. And that's actually, defeats the purpose of multicultural education, because the purpose is to, demolish those barriers and get people more, mixed. So intercultural education, then was developed in response to the limitation of multicultural education, and they emphasize the break those boundaries, let people interact with each other, and let's emphasize similarities and commonalities and sameness. For example, in Hong Kong, instead of talking about, for example, the chief executive says to you, "Oh, you're from Pakistan. What's the delicious dish from your country?" That's good. That's multicultural. But then a lot of scholars argue that this is very tokenistic. Nothing is really achieved by knowing my food or my clothing or my music. This is like, just a hallway multiculturalism, they call it. Yeah, you put a few posters and, students of different colors. And this is being done in HKU. Every year, the admission booklet. It's like, right, one student from each color. And then, welcome to HKU, internationalization, right? But then we want a real movement towards social action that empower people to participate, to become active members of society. And in order to do that, we need to know each other in a deeper sense, in a thicker manner. We need to know each other's perspectives, values, understandings of society, etc. And to do that, we need deeper conversations, deeper interactions. So that's where intercultural education comes in. Basically, intercultural education, as Dr. Jackson, who was once a professor at HKU, she basically put forward two major points under intercultural education. One is democratic deliberation, which means we have to just talk openly, understand each other's perspectives. And number two is critical media literacy, which is to deconstruct media messages and see what are the agendas behind, what are the perspectives behind. And both of these are very important in Hong Kong.